Well, hello and welcome. I hope you liked my hat. This is just an indication of what our show is today. And my guest today is Dr. Heather Duda, who is the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. But she has some surprises in store for us that I think you will want to stay tuned for. Thank you. Well, welcome back. We're so glad that you are joining us today. We have a real treat, well, trick or treat, depending on how you see it. But I am so happy that Dr. Heather Duda is here, and she has done some fascinating research that we are going to talk about today. And you can see that we're kind of decorated a little bit for Halloween, but, you know, witches and witchcraft is not related to Halloween. It's an all year round type of thing. So Dr. Duda has done some very interesting research, and it's not just related to witches, it's related to monsters. But I don't know if you consider witches monsters. I really don't consider them monsters, but I think we thought this would be something that we could talk about and kind of dress up in our witch hats. So tell us, what kind of research did you do about monsters?
Well, I actually work with monster hunters, which, if you know anything about the history of monster hunters, or monsters in general, there's usually a monster and then there's usually someone who fights the monsters. So this goes back in mythology quite a ways. In terms of the written text, we would maybe point to something like Beowulf, where you've got Grendel and Grendel's mom, and then the dragon, and of course Beowulf fights those. And then today, more late 20th, early 21st century monster hunters tend to be monsters themselves. And I'm really interested in the way a monster chooses or is forced into monster hunting, because that is a rather unique element of the genre from about the last maybe 30, 35 years. Although we see elements of it prior to the last 30, 35 years, it's really sort of become a staple of the genre recently.
Oh, that's interesting. So how did monsters start to chase monsters? How did that develop?
Well, it really, to some extent develops out of the vampire mythology. There are stories in Eastern European mythology, vampire mythology, of what I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it correctly, not being able to speak sort of Renaissance Romanian, but the best I can figure the pronunciation would be a dampir. And it is a half-breed, the child of a vampire and a mortal, who has the strength to be able to fight usually a father vampire, not a mother vampire. And so we've got that history there. So that entity goes back several centuries, but really emerges sort of in the 1970s, 60s even, where you have texts like Interview with a Vampire, where we as readers are supposed to be sympathetic to Louis and Lestat and their eternal life, where we, you have the John Badham Dracula in the 1970s. In his version, he's the guy who plays Dracula, and he's sort of the romantic debonair. We have the beginnings of sort of the romantic debonair vampire. And so what also happens is the Vietnam War. All of a sudden, America started to question its government and its real-life monster hunters, its military. They were hearing more and more about the atrocities that were being committed during war. So you've got, culturally and historically, you've got the Vietnam War. You also have the attack, or perceived attack, on family values in the 1970s, legalized abortion, legalized birth control, easier divorces. These things are coming together, and the American public is saying, wait, you're ruining the family. And so this sort of move in pop culture for a sympathetic monster, the Vietnam War, that real life monster hunters are not being viewed as positively as they had prior to the Vietnam War. You have this perceived attack on families, and all of a sudden your monsters may not be so bad, that maybe your non-monsters are really the bad guys. And sort of that begins the shift to seeing, exploring what maybe monsters could do if they're tasked with fighting their own. Plus, the monsters themselves, through the horror genre, kept getting bigger and badder and faster and meaner, and so mortals just didn't quite have the abilities anymore to fight those kind of monsters. Like the men and woman of Dracula did. So all these things kind of come together. That's a long answer to say all these things come together, and when you don't have mortals who can fight monsters, you got to get the monsters to fight them.
Oh my goodness. How interesting that has been kind of a cultural change based on what our own society is doing or what our own society is about or the happenings that we're all experiencing. And that it wasn't just humans fighting monsters, but now we have a whole new group of strong, powerful monsters who are probably fighting for us because we can't fight for ourselves.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly.
So that brings up some other questions about how, as we look at the movies, theater, those productions, the Power Rangers and those kinds of the good fighting the evil, and how their strength is artificially produced because they have superpowers. So that's interesting that has developed.
And we really like that. I mean, that's permeated all elements of pop culture with our heroes. If you even watch something like The Avengers, you've got that sort of dark streak that runs through The Avengers even. So it's not just in horror and Gothic literature and film that we see that duplicity, that good guy, bad guy within the same character anymore, but we see the good guys and the bad guys, there's much more of, or much less of a divide. They're moving back and forth. And certainly is something that emerges in the graphic novels as well. There's a lot of graphic novels that do it. The Watchmen, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, a lot of Alan Moore's work.
Well, and you think about the battle of good and evil and how we kind of personify that in other characters outside ourselves. I just want to point out that this research that Dr. Duda has done is actual research. I mean, it is not just looking at, comic books or looking at history. This is well-founded academic research that you have done on the whole topic of monsters and how they developed and from the period of time that you first mentioned up until the current time, plus what the cultural effect is on how they're represented.
I utilize, in my research, I tend to utilize three actually significant theoretical lenses or methodologies. I work with the horror genre, horror and Gothic research, so I have to be very well aware of that body of research. I also am what's considered a cultural critic in literature, which means that I have to understand what the literature or the film or the television or the comic book, I work with all those media, how they're fitting within the culture of their time, both the people who are producing them, but also the people who are receiving them, and how that changes when people over time receive them. So I have to know not only, for example, what Bram Stoker was thinking when he wrote Dracula, I have to know how the 1897 audience consumed Dracula, how they thought, then the various movie adaptations all the way through. And one of my great interests is gender studies. So I often look at, I'm very interested in how women are represented in these texts. And so I also have to be very knowledgeable about mostly feminist literary and film studies. Although when I say feminist, what I mean is not anti-male studies, but just how are women, so feminist studies as I use it, is how are women represented And sometimes I even get into a little bit about sexuality and masculinity and femininity, but mostly I do focus on women because you can't do everything. That sounds like a lot,
Right.
but there's even more I could look at, and I leave those for other scholars.
So is your work published? I mean, have you written books? Are there places where we could find out more? I mean, I would usually ask you that at the end, but I'm so interested in knowing where we could find out more. I don't want to forget that question.
Sure, yes. My dissertation was revised and then published by McFarland Press, The Monster Hunter in Modern Popular Culture. It's pretty cool. It's got a picture of Blade on the cover. I've also had a couple of articles published. There's a collection of 21st century Gothic literature, and I have a chapter in that on a novel called The Meaning of Night, where I talk about the vigilante character in that. And most recently in a collection on 21st century monstrosity that was published by Universidad Press. I have a chapter on the movie, the recent movie I, Frankenstein, which allowed me to explore a little bit. My focus in my dissertation was really that process by how a monster becomes a monster hunter. And I say if you're a male monster hunter, that usually happens through some desire to seek redemption. And I touch upon the soul, but really talk more about love and community. And the movie I, Frankenstein allowed me to kind of go back and explore how the soul fits into that dynamic a little bit more, because there's more about the soul in that text than there were in some of the others. But ultimately, it's really hard to define something that's undefinable. So that article allowed me to kind of explore the ideas of what a soul is.
Well, that's so interesting that there's actually a spiritual aspect to this topic that sometimes we just think, oh, it's just a fun thing, it's just a scary thing, but it's actually much deeper than that. And you mentioned how women are depicted, how men are depicted, sexuality, and then the spiritual aspect of it. But I want to back up just a moment and ask you, how did you become interested in this topic?
It's funny because I often, when people find out what I study, I don't know if I don't look what they expect. First of all, I don't know what you expect somebody who studies this to look like.
I was surprised.
The first thing. But I often will get that. They'll say, "Really, you study horror?" I have loved scary stories since I heard my very first one as a little girl.
Which was?
The Golden Arm.
Oh my goodness.
Yes, that was, I still remember it, and if you don't know it, I'm not going to do the injustice of trying to tell the story, because I love to listen to them. I'm really not a good scary storyteller.
Oh, okay.
So The Golden Arm, I remember hearing that, and I got chills, and I thought that was fun. I loved the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark series. And that led me on to vampires and ghosts and witches. My first Stephen King text was the 1980s miniseries It, which my mom had borrowed. My mom's a huge fan of scary movies. My mom had borrowed from a friend, and my parents were out one night, and I thought, I'm going to watch this movie. And I thought I was doing something I shouldn't, so it was really exciting. I'm like, ooh. I didn't realize how long it was, and my parents came home in the middle of it. And I had all the lights out in the house, and we lived out in the country, so there weren't any other lights. And they came in, and I was curled up, and I was watching it, and they said, well, what are you doing? I said, I'm watching this movie. Are you scared? A little. Should you stop watching it? I don't think so. Well, okay, then enjoy the rest of it. I mean, that was the conversation. And from there, I just continued on. And so I'm very thankful to my parents, my mom for always wanting to watch a scary movie, and my dad who does not particularly enjoy horror films, but also never said, why are you doing that? You should watch other stuff.
Right. So there must be a part of us as humans that we like to be scared. What is that about? Why do we like to have that little scary moment?
Theorists, and actually I think we're getting more into your area of research expertise, but I have read that some folks who study this say it goes back to the fight or flight gene that we have within us, and that there have been studies where when people's heart rates, you know, they go up or down. Often it's described as the roller coaster effect in horror studies, where as we're consuming the text, be it written or visual, we get scared, we release that tension. When good things happen, we follow the protagonist's emotional experience, and that goes back to our days where we actually had to fight or flight. And that's what the horror genre is providing us now that we're safe in our own home, so it's a safe space, but it's a safe space to have this sort of endorphin release or this emotional release. So that's the theory.
Right. Now, have you noticed that if you're in a theater and you're watching a scary movie that you've never seen before, so you don't know what to anticipate, but if people are scared, they'll go, "Oh!" and then they laugh.
Yes.
Have you noticed that? And
yes.
then they laugh. And I don't know if that's a tension reliever or not, but I just always thought that's so interesting.
There is actually a scholarly book called Laughing Screaming, and it is about that very thing, about the communal experience of watching a horror film and having the oh my gosh, I can't believe I just did that, because you realize you're not really being pursued, so then you release that tension, and then it just happens again and again. I actually, when I go see horror films in the movie theater, spend almost as much time watching the audience as I do the film, because I enjoy seeing people have those emotional reactions.
I'll bet you do, yes. So tell me, what are some of the characteristics that monsters have?
The big characteristic is that a monster is almost always going to be an other to society. So whatever your dominant ideals are of a society, anyone who doesn't fit those dominant ideals, they're probably at risk of becoming a monster. So we started the program talking about witches, and witches are considered monsters in some cultures, especially cultures that are extremely patriarchal. Which means that they're very male-dominated, so any female that has those masculine characteristics, so a woman who was smart or clever or witty, a woman who maybe inherited her husband's wealth but chose not to marry again, a woman who owned the modes of production, so maybe she owned a mill or maybe she owned a very useful farm. If these women could not be controlled by the men in their life, they were often at risk of being accused of being a witch, because they were a danger to the men who were in charge, or at least they were perceived as being a danger
to the society norms, right? And that would diminish their power if they could be accused of being witches or persecuted. So when did, speaking of witches, when did that actually start? In your research, when did the witches first appear in a culture? I would say I don't think I can pinpoint it. I don't do a lot of research with witches per se, but I would say that you have some sort of witch character. I'm thinking Grendel's mom is a witch character. I'm thinking that it certainly would go back far beyond Beowulf culturally, where you would have these stories of these women's, the hag, the banshee, even if they weren't called witches, that sort of crone character, that knowledgeable old woman who had some sort of power or was perceived as having some sort of power. And isn't it interesting that they're characterized in what some people would say would be culturally more negative characteristics, physical characteristics, older, unattractive, dark clothing and whatever, so there wouldn't be the appeal that you would normally think of as far as women being more soft and feminine and blonde and, you know, those kinds of characteristics that typically we look at, And
I don't know where because eventually that sexuality is associated with women, with witches, so eventually people get worried that witches do become a little bit beautiful or have some sort of sexual magnetism, which also could ensnare the men, like, oh, watch out for this woman. If she doesn't have, you know, the wit or the intellect, maybe she's got the sexual attraction. And I know
like
that
trances and that power to bewitch.
Yes.
To bewitch someone.
Yes.
Okay.
I know that's one of Merlin's guises is as the beautiful woman.
Oh, that's right.
You know, to see if what it's like to live live both. I think maybe if Merlin doesn't do it, it's one of the stories he tells in one of the myths, and some of the other Arthur myths. You've got sort of that beautiful woman who's enchanting,
Yes.
and she is also the witch.
And oftentimes when we think about witches, and I'm certainly not an expert, but I've observed a lot. And of course, my first appreciation for witches was in Macbeth.
Yes.
That first scene, I love the first scene in Macbeth with the three witches.
Yes.
But we actually, and we know in our own country, the whole negative aspect about women and witches was really a tragedy with the Salem witch trials.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were not all women. There was
that's
at
right.
least Giles
That's right.
Corey. There might have been another
right.
male who was also killed, and we still today don't have a very good reason as to why this witch hysteria happened in Salem. There are a lot of arguments about culture, about society, that they were sort of stronger women. It was a society that was very anti-female, going back to John Winthrop and Anne Hutchinson, I think, where she was a woman, one of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. If she wasn't original to the Massachusetts Bay, she was soon after. And she had a Bible study, which was encouraged. It was encouraged for women to teach young children and other women. The problem was men started going to it. She was apparently very, very good. And John Winthrop and his fellow judges brought her in and questioned her. And she managed for 3 days to avoid getting herself into a trap. And eventually she said one wrong thing and they went, aha! And she and her family were kicked out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and massacred by the Native American population. And so going back that far, you had that, even from the very beginnings of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, you had that fear. And Salem's only about 25 miles up the road.
Oh, right.
So of course that I have no doubt that sort of was the beginnings of what would culminate in the Salem witch trials.
And I think that during this time of year, that actually the city of Salem is a place where a lot of people go, and they have a lot of, I don't want to say festival, but a lot of activities related to the history of that time. And I've also noticed that our witches' hats are actually very similar to pilgrim hats.
They are. They are. And all the elements of a witch's costume do have meaning, and unfortunately I don't know them, but
I don't either.
Google will show anybody who's interested. Do you know one of the other things that Salem has a lot around this time, I've been to Salem a couple of times, is they have a very strong Wiccan population, which is
real.
Of course, a religious, spiritual community that is very active today in the 21st century. And a lot of people do associate Wiccans with witches, but they're very, very separate. And so that is sometimes an error that people make.
Right, right. So tell me, who's your favorite monster, or what is your favorite monster?
I really love the show Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And so it was the inspiration for my research and has been an inspiration for my research. So I would say that probably the characters on Buffy, they transform from monster to monster hunter. They are both good and evil. I like that ambiguity, and they're just plain fun. So I would say that the Joss Whedon's sort of, fans call it the Buffyverse. I would say the characters of the Buffyverse are some of my favorite monsters and monster hunters.
Great, yeah. So, have you ever seen or felt the presence of a monster or something that you couldn't explain?
I haven't, but I firmly believe that other people have, and it's one of those things where I totally support folks and would never naysay, and I love to hear people's stories, but I myself have never never experienced anything supernatural. And I think I'm a little happy about that, because I'm not sure. I'd probably, despite the fact that I've studied this for so long, I'd probably go running and screaming for the hills. I know that about myself, so maybe it's better I haven't.
It would prove that you were right, that they really exist. Yes. Right, yeah. But what do most other people think about monsters? What's their concept?
I think a lot of people dismiss them as something silly. I think that a lot of people believe that monsters are just these silly things in hats and capes, and they can turn into bats, and they walk around with their arms stuck out and plot if you're Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah.
And that's
or
a
like
shame.
Night of the Living, or what?
Yes, the zombies. So you're just going to eat
forth,
brains. And I don't think there's anything wrong with recognizing that those are pop culture monsters. But what I always remind people is that our monsters are actually telling us what our society is afraid of. So monsters are always symbolic. So as I mentioned, the Vietnam War, well, right after the Vietnam War was the rise of the zombie and the slasher film, and it was this idea of mindless slaughter. That was what people were most concerned about in the post-Vietnam era. This sort of, how do we deal as a society with what we were seeing in the news in terms of deaths and destruction? Well, then we have slasher films that are about monsters that do nothing but death and destruction.
So it kind of makes sense then, the whole study. So what do you tell children about monsters?
Well, I think you have to let them discover monsters on their own. So
Just like you did.
Yes, I've got young nieces and nephews, and most of them are too young to really get into sort of the monsters. But I think you just tell them when they're interested and they have questions. I think they should think they're fun, and I certainly wouldn't burden them with the symbolic.
Fun. So I will be thinking about you as we move closer to Halloween, and I may have to come back and ask you some more questions, but I'm so glad you came today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is a fun time of the year, and it's so exciting to see how many people get engaged and decorate and have a lot of fun with it, and I love it.
Great. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
And thank the rest of you for watching and learning more about monsters and witches. And we look forward to our next broadcast. Thanks again.